And we are joined today by Kelly Bornman, who is our ERB consultant. And before she starts us off with a deep understanding of our CTP-5 Educational Record Bureau testing and scores, I want to kind of frame our conversation in the parameters of how CASE uses this test and these scores, and also how we do not. So we administer this test to grades 4 through 7. And the primary purpose is for programmatic review. So we are able to see areas of relative strength and weakness, or strength and growth in our curriculum. We are able to see the impacts of curricular changes or interventions, and we're able to track classes of students over time. We do not use these scores to evaluate or draw conclusions about individual students. We have a pretty robust assessment scheme at CASE that relies on a lot of internal assessment. Thank you. That relies on a lot of internal assessments, class assessments, things that are tied directly to our curriculum and that are used to turn around and directly inform instruction and report on our benchmarks. And ERB is not one of those. The primary purpose is for us to get a zoomed out view of our program, and for us to be able to compare ourselves with our peer schools, and as you'll see in a moment, most of which are monolingual peers, and ensure that our program on the English side is as robust as we all hope it to be. And we do not share these scores with high schools. They're not part of a child's high school application process. The scores are going to be seen by you, your child's teacher, and us here at CASE, and will not be shared otherwise unless you actually sign off on a release for another school's application. So it's really a low stakes test for the individual student, the way that we see it, yet the data is quite useful for CASE in order for us to track our curriculum and program and really inform our decision-making about our next steps as a school. So let's keep that in mind as we're looking at the scores.
All right, thanks, Christina. So my name, as Christina said, is Kelly Bornman, and I am from ERB, or the Educational Records Bureau. Prior to joining to ERB, I was a 30-year career educator at independent schools here in California and also in New York City. So I'm delighted to be bringing my work as an educator to this conversation, as well as my understanding of our tools that we have available to our member schools, as well as for our member schools to share with their families. So thank you all for being here today. It's a terrific opportunity to engage with everyone. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. As Christina mentioned, we are recording this session. So for whatever reason you need to leave or step out earlier, you will definitely have an opportunity to get a copy of this. For right now, we're just going to ask everybody to stay on mute so that we can get through our presentation, but we'll have an opportunity at the end to answer some questions. If you pop some things in the chat, Christina and you can message us directly, and we can certainly address those again at the end. Christina, of course, if anything comes in while I'm speaking that I'm not monitoring the chat, let me know and we can stop and we can address those if there needs to be any points of clarification at that point in time. Okay. Great. So just a little bit about ERB. I won't spend too much time on this, but for those of you, if you're new to us, we are a nonprofit organization, and we have been working with independent schools for over 90 years. And we are just delighted to continue to build out our relationships with those. We pride ourselves on partnerships with our member schools, and we look to provide insight and opportunities for schools to use data to inform, as Christina said, in its purest form, to inform curriculum and instruction. And it is one piece, and we'll talk about this in a moment, one piece of the much bigger puzzle of understanding a student and their learning. But we're happy to have tools that can support educators in fostering a student's potential in their classroom and in their school settings. We also do have programmatic options for social emotional learning programs, as well as student engagement. Here we're to talk about today one of our achievement tools. So just as a high level view, Christina gave a very pointed view of how CASE uses our tools, but we'll just talk a little bit and sort of painting the picture of our perspective of using these types of tools and why do we give standardized testing. And much of which, or all of which, align with what Christine has already shared with you. Education is complex and includes many parts, and the goal of every educator and schools is to really best serve the students that are as part of their community, so that students can achieve their personal goals, but that they can also reach their maximum learning potential. And it's important to understand that any standardized test is one metric, and how that metric gets used will inform different decisions that the school might make. Of course, we have what the teacher knows to be true. These are the persons that are spending all of the time with your children. They know your students best. They engage with them in so many different ways once they step foot on school campus until they leave for the day. So that piece is incredibly important, as is what the student knows to be true about their learning, about their engagement with the school community, about the curriculum that they're accessing. So these two components make up the most important part of understanding a student and their ability to reach their learning potential. And then, of course, layering on what the data indicates. Christina mentioned tools that they use in the classrooms in terms of different types of assessments. But as educators, we're assessing and trying to understand student learning in many, many different ways, both informally and formally. Standardized testing is just one of those metrics. Putting all of these pieces together allows educators and families to find that sweet spot in where a student needs support and where they might need challenge in terms of, again, reaching their greatest potential. So kind of highlighting again, why do we use a standardized assessment? It is opportunity to monitor individual student progress, opportunity to diagnose an area's student skill set, in terms of their strengths and their areas of growth. And really importantly, as Christina mentioned, to monitor curriculum implementation. Is what we're doing, are we seeing that students are meeting the benchmarks that we've set? How do we then reflect as educators to know where there are areas in the curriculum, opportunities for growth, opportunities for strength? And it allows schools to plan for improvement. So those metrics can be incredibly helpful for that. In terms of standardized testing data, it's for a wide variety of audience. It's here. It's, of course, for administrators and teachers, as we've discussed, families, which is what we're here to talk about today, and community of learners. And at the end of the day, it's most important for the students themselves, because this information is helping us understand where they're at in their learning and how we can best support them. And I know I've probably said that like 15 times already, but I just continue to message that at the end of the day, as a company for us, and certainly the schools we work with, it's what's in service of the students. Of course, what standardized testing don't measure are study skills and organizational skills and their collaboration and cooperation and communication, all those big C words, creativity, and their language. So one piece of this much bigger puzzle, it is a snapshot. It is not designed, Christine used the words low stakes. This is not designed to be a test for judgment. This is really information, and that data is used in service of making sure that we best support your students. Okay, so to the test itself, the CTP, some people refer to it as the ERBs. That's because that's our company name, but folks may know it as that. But the CTP stands for the Comprehensive Testing Program, and it falls into two categories. We have verbal subtests and we have math subtests. We also have verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning subtests, and you can see the listing here on what those options are that schools have a chance to use when they're delivering the CTP. What sets our test apart from other standardized tests is that we do have these verbal and quantitative reasoning areas, which allows a school to understand a student's aptitude or potential in verbal and quantitative areas, and not just their skills. So it's a really neat crosswalk of being able to see what a student's potential is, as well as their skill set right now. In terms of standards, you can see some initials on there. For the verbal tests, we base our questions on the National Council for Teachers of English, so that's the NCTE, and then the ILA, which is the International Literacy Association. In terms of our math subtests, we have the National Councils of Teachers of Mathematics. And so those are the standards. We find that those work best for the independent school population that we serve. And that's what we draw from. So just an overview of the CTP itself. Now I'm going to just give a quick overview of some of the statistical terminology that we'll be talking about today, just some broad strokes, and then we'll look at some different reports, which will help you understand how your school is doing overall, excuse me, but then also the individual report that you receive about your child. So scaled score is a score that you will see, and the purpose of a scaled score is to compare your student's score to other groups of students. So it measures, also allows us to measure growth over time. We are norm referenced assessments, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments, but all norm referenced assessments start with a scaled score. And so the scaled score is based on actual test performance, and then our scale score is also a vertical scale. So it's meant to go up each year as a student is demonstrating their academic growth. So unlike something like an SAT, which has a very specific scale, it's always set at the same scale and every student is trying to achieve that particular number, our scaled scores will change. So the most important piece for you when you're thinking about your own student is you're looking for about a 40 to 60 point growth each year. So if you just kind of keep that range in mind as you're looking at your students' scaled scores over time, that is really the most helpful number to remember. And what many of us are familiar with is the bell curve. And so we do have some metrics where you will see either a stay9 or a percentile rank. Both of those metrics are just a different way to represent the bell curve. So when thinking about using norm references and plotting students, maybe not say it that way, plotting students, we're looking at students' scores, we will line those students' scores up from sort of 0 to 100. And so in any scale that you're looking at or any norm group that you're looking at, students fall somewhere on that bell curve. Somebody will be at the sort of the one end and somebody will be up at the other end. In terms of stay9, basically what we do then is break that bell curve into 9 different segments. The bulk of students, this is what the bell curve is right, is that we've distributed students and student scores over the course of that 0 to 100. The bulk of the students will fall in that center of that bell curve. And so that's would be your stay9s 4, 5, and 6. And then we'll have students that will fall into the lower end, which would be your stay9s 1, 2, and 3. And then the upper end, stay9s 7, 8, and 9. And you can see the correlating percentile ranks down below, which is just a little more granular. Something I do like to point out, students who are in those middle stay9s, it's a much wider gap to move between a stay9 4 and a stay9 5 than it would be to move between, say, a stay9 1 and a stay9 2, right? There's only there's a smaller distance between the percentiles when we break that up. So something to keep in mind. Again, I can't stress enough when we're thinking about norms and norm groups. It's just one metric. What it doesn't show you per se is what your student actually knows about the content that's being assessed. And that's where I encourage families to think about when they're looking at their student, what their student knows relative to the curriculum. And this is where a lot of students, teachers will focus on is what is the student's mastery of a content that they're being assessed on. So this is based on actual test performance. It is not a comparison. So that bell curve is like, so where do we all line up along this line for our group, right? Who's the tallest, who's the shortest, and everyone in between. Percent mastery is very specific to what a student knows. It is not the same as percent correct. And we'll talk about that when we look at the report in a little while. It also takes into account the difficulty or the weight of the questions. And so with the CTP, there are a range of question types. We have questions that might be recall, but all the way up to questions that are reasoning questions where students might need to perform multiple steps mentally in order to achieve or to determine the answer. So all of this is calculated into the percent mastery, and it uses item response theory, which is a sort of a complicated metric in order to make sure that we have represented a student's understanding of the tool. I've mentioned norm groups a couple of times. We use some different norm groups that schools have the option to look at, one of which is a national norm. And so that national norm is going to represent a broad population of students in the 50 states. It represents urban, rural, suburban, all different socioeconomic groups, and that would be a broadest norm, right? Comparing or looking at students and learners of all types, independent, public, private, parochial, and so forth. The independent norm group, however, this is a subset of that national norm. These would be students who are attending independent schools and are also members of ERB and taking the same assessment during the same time period that students at CASE would be. So if your school is testing in the fall, then you would be normed against or normed alongside of other schools that are also testing at that same time frame. So when looking at a score report, a student can have the same understanding of the content, but when they're compared to different groups of other students taking assessment, the scores may look very different. And again, I just like to message this does not indicate that your student, their knowledge has changed. It's just when you're standing against, I'm 5'5". If I were standing in a group of a bunch of folks who are 6'5", I'm always going to look much shorter than them, but my height isn't changing as opposed to if I was standing with other folks who are 5'5". So it's just it's a matter of comparison. So you can just see some differences here. The national norm representing that light green, and then the independent norm represented by that golden rod. Similar high achieving students, it's just relative to the norm group that they're in to what their metrics might look like. This is a representation, and again, we'll just kind of look at national norm and independent norm. This is percentile rank. And so here we'll have the blue diamond would represent a student's actual score on the particular subtests, in this case, verbal reasoning, whereas the band that surrounds that blue diamond would be what we would expect, the range that we would expect that student to perform in if they were to take that same subtest or that same subtest perhaps with different questions, same content, but different questions, or on a different day. Right? We know that all of these are a snapshot in a moment in time, and then we can have our good days and our bad days. So there's a range, our knowledge is the same, but there's a range of how we might respond. So this would be percentile rank for a national group, norm group. Same student, but looking now at the independent norm groups. You can see that verbal reasoning shifted to the left. Again, student still knows the same amount of information. It's just relative to the students that are in that particular group that you're comparing them against. So in terms of thinking about CASE as a school, we have the opportunity to take a look at some of the metrics for the overall group. And one of the reports that I know Christina likes to take a look at and has asked us to share today is our median percentile report. So this gives us an opportunity, again, this is more like that 30,000-foot view of how the school is doing. So what's the median, right? Where are we in terms of the whole group that's taking this assessment for a particular grade level? And I tell you, I do a lot of these parent ed meetings and school meetings, and it's always a delight when I get to look at median percentile reports that I see that your school has. So here we are on this, there's a lot of colors, lots of little numbers and so forth, but just to give you sort of a crosswalk of what we're looking at is we have each of the subtests are down here at the bottom. And right now, this is, we're looking at level 3. So this would be grade 4 students. And we have GN represents the group norm. So that's your particular group at school. IN, which is the independent norm. And then CAIS is the California independent, California Association of Independent Schools, not to be confused with, with the name of your school. Your school on this chart is represented as GN, and then NN represents the national one. Christina, do you want me to say anything before I get into some of the metrics of the actual report? You want to tap in here?
Yeah, I will just say that, we share these school-wide reports every year in the spirit of transparency. And one of the things that we see in our reading scores and our writing and everything with our internal assessments, and then is mimicked by the ERB and stands up in the literature about bilingualism, is, what you may have heard of the term of the bilingual delay. But what we see is that sometimes our students are lower compared to the norm group at the earlier grades. And what we tend to see is when we follow the same group of students over years, they not only catch up, but surpass. And so you'll see that kind of represented in these scores where like case looks less strong compared to the norm group starting in 4th grade. But by the time we get up to 7th grade, you'll see cases outperforming in every area. And that just kind of tracks with how we understand students who are functioning in 2 languages and the gift of bilingualism that we're giving to our kiddos. So I just wanted to make sure we named that before we get in.
Thank you, Christina. And truly, it's what a gift that your students have that opportunity to do that in that bilingual experience. But just looking at this as, again, kind of come back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier. We've got your group in the blue, and then the 2 different norm groups represented in the different purples and the green. So the national norm on the actual chart is this black line, black dotted line right here in the center. So by and far, I mean, your case students are far above the national norm, but really on par. And I know we see some differences here, but minor differences when we're thinking about statistical change in terms of how your groups are performing. So I'll just click through here. This is our grade 4 students. We'll be taking that fall assessment. This is your grade 5 students. Again, consistently strong. You'll see with Christina was mentioning here where you start to see that bump in terms of some of those reading and verbal and writing skills as the students are just moving up through the grades. Again, very normal, very expected in terms of as students gain more knowledge, right, they become more proficient in their abilities. This would be grade 6. Again, fall of last year, so following that similar trajectory. And then this would be our grade 7. Again, consistently performing far above that national norm, and then in many cases above the independent or the California Association of Independent Schools. It's really terrific to be able to see that. As we think about your students' individual score report, again, this is a snapshot in time. I'd also like to point out at this, Christine and I were just talking as we got on, we're coming up on just about 3 years from when we shut down with COVID. And COVID is certainly, we're seeing this play out in schools across the country and across the world, that we're just starting to understand any impacts that have been experienced by students in terms of, I mean, we know there have been impacts, but we're starting to see it play out in different ways in their scores. Your school consistently, has done what independent schools do best, is they really meet students where they're at, figured out the pivot, and your median percentile scores are looking quite terrific. But I just do want to share that at an individual student level, please make sure you're always taking into account anything that's going on for them as an individual, as we think about what may have been going on for them in that moment in time when you're looking at their scores from their ERB tests and CTP. All right, so the individual report that's been shared with you is the individual subscore report. Now, this is a sample report here, and this happens to be a middle school report, but it looks the same for anybody who would be receiving this. At the top, you will see the subtests that have been taken by your school. Here's that scaled score we spoke about earlier. Again, most importantly for you is if you're saving your students' reports over time, is you're looking for that 40 to 60 point growth. right, over the coming years for your student. And then we have the national norm and the independent norm. So you'll see the student's percentile rank. So that is out of 100 where that student might fall. And then you'll see your stay-9, which is that representative again of that bell curve of where they might fall on that curve. Now you can see with this student here, we've got national norm versus the independent norm, same content mastery, but a completely different representation in terms of percentile rank and stay-9. Student still knows the same thing. It's just as they're normed against a more competitive group of students, there is an expectation that their stay-9 and percentile rank change there. Down at the bottom here is where we're looking at that content mastery. And this is really where to dig in terms of where's your students' understanding in terms of that content that they're being assessed on. So on the left, you'll see the subtest, and then underneath that, you'll see the main domains or the main areas that are assessed under that particular category. So for verbal reasoning, we also have analogical reasoning, categorical reasoning, and logic. The students' score, their content mastery, will be on the left, and then the norm group will be on the right. And what you're looking at here is the relationship between these two numbers. So this is not as much out of 100% as it is about where is my student in terms of the level of mastery of this content. As an educator, and I'm looking at my students over the course of the year, there's very few times when I would expect a student to have 100% mastery of everything that I'm teaching in a particular subject area, because of the way education works and the way curriculum works is that we're scaffolding and layering over time. And so it would be an expectation, or very rare, I should say, for either an individual student or in any of our norm groups for us to be seeing numbers that are 95, 97, 98, 99. So this particular student here, areas of strength overall, verbal reasoning, right there with the independent norm group. If you want to get really granular here, logic is an area that is not quite as strong in terms of categorical and analogical reasoning. On the right-hand side, you'll see just a graphical representation of the numbers that are over here on the left. And so you can see where that student might be, in this case, equal to what the norm group is, or whether they are trending above or below. So that's the main overview that we have of the actual score reports that you'll receive at home. Just some things to keep in mind and takeaways of this is that the test is a moment in time. It literally is a snapshot. There are many things that affect test performance in terms of student and individual subtest. And the information is designed to guide instruction, not define a student. Certainly, if you have questions, you reach out to Christina or the mechanisms that have been set forth for you in terms of speaking with your child's teacher. And then learning is a process, and this is important for us. I think we all know that learning is a process. It's not a static experience. And so these tools, this information is really, in my sense, opportunity to ask questions and to get curious and to perhaps even start some conversations with your own students or how they're experiencing this and how they're experiencing the curriculum. So I'm just going to pause there for just a moment. Christina, is there anything that you'd like me to review or to address before we open up to questions?
No, I don't think so. I think we can go to questions. I do want to pick up the thread about what to do in terms of communication. If walking out of this meeting, you do have more individual questions. So I would be the first pass to go to for questions about a child's ERB report. Sometimes the conversation that we have it's a great thing to check in with the teacher about. I always say, I think Kelly just said it too, the ERB scores are a great place to start asking questions and not a great place to draw any conclusions about a child. So I might send you after we talk back to the teacher to say, is this consistent with what you see in class? But if in terms of if you would like to have an individual meeting about your child's scores, I would be the person to do that with, not the classroom teacher.
Thanks, Christina. So we had a question here, Christina. I'm not sure if this came into you or not. It's asking about the age of your students relative to the age of the cutoff. And so just because I'm not, I mean, I have our answer in terms of our tools. I just want to make sure that you have a chance to address that if I'm understanding that question. It says, aren't case kids also younger than those at other schools given the age cutoff?
I don't believe so. I believe we have the same age cutoff as the other independent schools. But yeah, we're always looking into kid developmentally. You know, my kid has a June birthday and she's always going to be the youngest kid in her class. And I'm always going to remember that when I look at all of her academic data. You know, it's an imperfect system we have in this country where we kind of batch kids into developmental groups by the date on a calendar year that they're born. So that's one piece of information to kind of consider. Our scores are normed against other students in this other schools with kids in the same grade level who took the test at the same time.
Absolutely. So unless there is as a student who may be skipping ahead or something relative to something different than that sort of age cutoff that you have, it's really important. Christina said it, I've said it before, that we understand that you are normed against and the assessments are targeted specific to the season that you are taking that assessment. So we use the level. So example, a level 4 CTP would be taken in the fall by students who are beginning their 5th grade year. And those students are very different in their trajectory of learning what will be assessed on that than they would be if they were taking it in the spring. So it would be inappropriate for us to be comparing students who are taking a level 4 assessment in the fall versus the spring because they just haven't had that content yet. So that's all taken into consideration when we create our norms and our norm groups.
Kelly, I have a question about the independent norm group and the California norm group, which I think I can just answer. So the IN is the independent norm group nationally, and the CAIS norm group is not CASE. It's the California Association of Independent Schools. The reason we have a choice of which norm groups we want to include, and the reason I include those in the median percentile is because the California Association of Independent Schools tends to be a higher performing group. And I want to make sure that when I'm looking at data, I'm looking at it with a group that's more our peer schools. But yes, the IN is the national norm group. And
right. Yeah, I'm sorry, Christina, go ahead.
Another question I see is if we see relative areas of significant weakness within a category, i.e. stay 9-3, are there any things we should be doing as a parent to help support our child? So I will say again, this is a place to start asking questions and not drawing conclusions about a kid. I would never recommend tutoring or any intervention based on an ERB score alone. The first thing I would do is look back at our records. So we have the teachers kind of take anecdotal notes while we're administering the test. And sometimes we see a kid finish a test in 15 minutes or was super hungry or had been to the nurse, or, you know, there can be any reason. The second thing that I would recommend is just checking in with the child and the teacher about whether this is a perceived area of growth in the class. And we have other data points to kind of indicate that this is an area where we might want to pay a little bit more attention. And then the third thing I would say is, do we have other ERB points on this? So is this a 4th grader who this is their first experience taking the test? If so, let's wait and see what happens next year. Or is this a 7th grader who every year in a row has a lower score on this? And then we can have a conversation about what the next steps may be, but it's much more nuanced than looking at the score report and saying, I see a low score and I think we need to support our kid at home. Kelly, do you want to add?
Absolutely. I mean, Christina, you really just hit the nail on the head with exactly where I'd go with that. It's an opportunity to just get curious about this. There are so many factors that affect an individual testing time. I mean, the fire alarm could have gone off. It could be it hasn't, you know, I was in Las Vegas last week and they had flurries, you know, and that, you know, so that could distract a student who's looking outside the window. So it truly just asks questions. I would be very cautious of making any judgment, but let's just understand what's going on. And Christine, it sounds like the fact that your proctors are taking some notes, we highly recommend that. Be incredibly informative for students. So we have a couple of questions that have come in for me too. So let's see here. Talk a little bit about the pre-COVID scores at the same grade. So great question. And first of all, to let you all know that you can visit our website at erblearn.org. And if you sort of search for COVID, we have some white papers that are out on this, but I'll just sum it up because we are looking at this actively. We have folks in our research team who are doing that. In the early days of COVID, we, not surprisingly, we definitely saw a shift in scores. What I will say that unlike what we've seen at the national level in all learners, in the independent school market, where the schools that we serve, we saw a slowing of learning growth, but not a learning loss. And that's a really important nuance to understand here. And that made good sense as teachers were pivoting to online and doing all those things. And there were certain things that the delivery or curriculum changes, didn't quite hit in the same way that it would be. I was a sixth grade physics teacher. Teaching that on Zoom was very different than teaching that in person. But what we have seen is that we are actually returning to the same type of growth that we saw pre-COVID. And this is our most recent paper that's come out now, that we are back at the same rate of growth that we were pre-COVID, and that students are, and particularly in independent schools, are, I won't say that they're quite back to exactly where they were prior to COVID in all grade levels. Our younger students are, and because they were in those formative years when they COVID first hit. So that rate of return is not quite as quickly as it has been for some of the older students. But overall, independent schools are doing a great job with that, and students are returning to the level of growth.
Kelly, can I ask a follow-up question on that? I remember when I did look at the scores, I think 2 years ago, that was the first question on my mind too. And I remember the ERB consultant that we had at that time told me that because it's a 3-year rolling norm group, our scores were actually compared to the pre-COVID norm group. Is that still the case when we look at the scores today? Do those include the COVID years, or are those still?
Great question, Christina, and thanks for drawing that out. And I missed that in our earlier conversation. So yes, yes and no. At the early days, we froze the norms because of the numbers were changing, and we wanted to make sure that our norm pool was incredibly strong. So, but we have unfrozen the norms. Folks are returning to habits and testing and all of these things. So what we have right now is actually a 4-year rolling norm. We will move to a 4-year rolling norm again because of that first year of COVID, and the numbers had dropped, even for those fall schools. So that 4-year rolling norm, so it's including, so I think now that means we would have 1 year of pre-COVID, but mostly COVID numbers in there. So the representation of the norm groups very, very strong relative to what we know has been happening in the educational landscape in the last few years. And next year, by the time you take your fall of next year, it will be all sort of that COVID era data. Great question. I have another question in here is in terms of supporting students in terms of test taking skills versus their mastery of content. And I'm just going to give a highlight, and then Christina, maybe you can talk to individual school practices. There's a skill in anything that we do. And certainly in terms of test design and the number of questions that are asked and how the item response theory is, they try to correct for as much in terms of skill as possible. We definitely recommend to schools that you normalize this as much as possible. There's opportunities for practice. Students are able to draw on skills that they use in many other areas of their academic day. So I'll let Christina speak specifically to what CASE does, but that is certainly taken into account in terms of their understanding and performance.
We do offer some more scaffolded and kind of direct support for how to approach the tests in fourth grade, which is the first year that our students are taking the test. So general test taking strategies like process of elimination, previewing the questions, those kind of things. We do present students all the way up through seventh grade with items like the ones that will be on the test, especially those that are unfamiliar. Those areas like the quantitative reasoning test has a format where the answer selections are A is greater than B, B is greater than A and B are equal, or we don't have enough information to answer this question. And so we give them exposure to those kind of items so that they're not thrown by the format of the test. And the other one is analogies. That's not something that regularly comes up. So we make sure that they're familiar with the kind of approaches to the format of questions. But in terms of preparing students for the content, like I said, this is a low stake test. And test taking skills, I'm going to venture to say here now in the Bay Area, at least, is becoming a less critical skill, as well as the high schools are no longer requiring the PSAT. A lot of the UCs are making standardized testing optional. Actually, that's all of them. Is that Kelly?
I think so. Yeah, that's just all shifted. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of other universities as well. So just the high stakes nature of standardized tests, which is somewhat problematic in my view, it's kind of shifting right now as a result of the last couple of years. So, we used to say that test taking skill is a critical educational skill in terms of like getting through gates. And I think it's going to become less and less so for your particular students. And we want our students to feel comfortable enough as they sit down for the test to kind of know what they're looking at and be able to navigate it without confusion on format that gets in their way. But there's no content prep at all.
Yeah, and something I'd add on that too, and this goes back to one of the very first things that Christina said, the design and the goal of this tool is to understand what a student knows about a particular content area, and it's part of a conversation about the curriculum and instruction. So test prep in this case, it's not about hitting a certain number, because then that could be an inflated sense of what a student is actually understanding, or where there's areas of their real strengths or their growth. And so a more accurate picture for the educator and for the school is really to, of course, things that Christina talked about, format familiarity. Have they had practice sort of sitting and doing something for 40 minutes and not getting up and moving around? Like those kinds of things are important and to take into consideration. But I would not advise this. These are not the high stakes test. Christina's point of like, I have to get this number, I'm not going to get into this high school. The more accurate a student can be, or the less prepped they can be, the more accurate the information is for the educators in using that. So it's a slightly shift of a mindset that, at least from my experience growing up and taking these, but will be more informative overall.
I've got lots of questions here too. We're getting through all of them in the chat, everyone, so be patient with us. I've got a question. Do we have data that shows just our school norm group and averages? And we do not. And well, Kelly, you can tell the reason. I think I have an assumption about why, but go ahead.
Again, it's really important that one of the reasons, I mean, again, schools can choose to dissect the data as they choose to, but we don't want students or educators to feel like they're pitting students against students. And, if you have a group, 15 kids in a class, and that we're trying to identify who's this one and who's this one, it really does not support what the tool is meant to be used by. And so that is not data that we recommend schools. It's not in service of, I guess that's to say, it's not in service of the ultimate goal of the tool. Christina, any other thoughts on that one, or did you want to share more?
Yeah, I was thinking that, and also probably because the sample size of a school's norm group isn't
so small.
Yeah. Valid.
Yeah. And again, it becomes super skewed if you have one student, again, small groups, one student is performing really high or one student really had a bad day. It doesn't quite give you the information that you'd be looking for.
I have another question. Do teachers see these results and use them in any way, e.g. to help improve the in weaker areas in conjunction with other assessments? Yes, so teachers do see these results. And I give them the same spiel I gave you, where we're not drawing any conclusion about a kid and their needs based on just this one test, but we can ask questions. And if the test highlights an area that has already been on a teacher's radar, then this is an important piece of data for us to consider in a support plan for a student.
I don't have any other questions in my chat, Christina. Are there any more that you have outstanding?
Yes, I missed one. Have the topics in the test already been covered in the classrooms? For example, statistics. That is a really great question. So this test is not tied to our case-specific curriculum or our case-specific benchmarks. However, there is a lot of overlap between the NCTE and the NCTM standards that ERB is using for their content area mastery and the standards that CASE is using. It is totally possible that in our curriculum in a given year, when at the point at which a test is taken, we haven't covered a geometry unit or a statistics unit or something like that yet. And the point is not really of this assessment is not to test curricular knowledge. That is what we use our kind of unit assessments for in school. Kelly, do you want to add anything else about that?
Sure. And I think the other important thing is that to remember, a couple of things. We work with independent schools all over the world. The beauty of the independent schools is that they have the ability to be independent in terms of their curriculum and their development and following all of the good pedagogical practices. But there's never going to be 100% alignment with our tool. It's just not possible. It's not like we are following very strict, this is the textbook and this is the test. That Christine made that good point. The other piece is that you're a fall testing school. So your students are testing early in the year of when they are taking, as they're entering into this particular grade level. And the content that they're being assessed on most often is some prior year's content. And so that may be, they may have covered a skill. It could be a whole year earlier when they had taken that, or it may not have been covered in that particular grade level. So these variations, and again, Christina would be the expert on that. You don't teach statistics until much later, and the students have been exposed to it. It would be perfectly appropriate for them to not have a particularly strong score in that area.
Kelly, I just accidentally chatted to everyone one of the questions that just came in, which I think is a good one.
Oh.
Is it fair to say that this is measuring aptitude rather than content knowledge?
It's a great question. It's actually doing a little bit of both, because of the way the skills are. We use something called web steps of knowledge, and I think I've mentioned that earlier. And we have a variety of different types of questions in there. So they are actually measuring, absolutely measuring that aptitude, but there are some content knowledge questions in there. And certainly when it comes to something like mathematics, there are layered skills if they're asking to do some division, as opposed to reasoning out who, a reasoning question would be very different. So it's a little bit of a combination, and that's where you'll see some of that score in that content mastery score on your sub-score report. When you see those numbers there, that's more content, but pay close attention to what the categories are too. That would be helpful. Let's see, another question here. Oh, okay. In terms of understanding the different types of things in each of those. So we do have some resources on our website, and Christina, I can certainly point you in direction to those, but we do get some confused. So categorical reasoning, right? Can you put things in categories? And of course that how they change that for much as students get older. Analogical, so analogies, alike and as, and then the logic questions. Those are that's that verbal reasoning section. And so logic questions, and the school has access to different sample questions on that. You can, Google's a wonderful tool, not that you'll have our specific ones, but you can look up those kinds of questions as well. Okay, let's see, another questions. I'm just trying to read that question. Go ahead, Christina, sorry.
Can we touch a little bit more? Because I always get asked this on the quantitative reasoning and the mathematics scores and how to interpret when there are differences in those.
Sure. So, and let me just pull up, I'm sorry, I just closed my slide deck, which was an inadvertent click on my end. So let me pull up a slide deck because I can actually give you some sample questions there. If you just give me a moment to do that for you. Let's just get that up. I apologize for clicking that too fast. Okay, here we go. All right, and while that's kind of reloading itself, we wanted, somebody was asking a question. So about, again, this understanding of the curriculum, if we're seeing, but the large majority of students at CASE were showing lower scores in a particular subject area, or particular domain, is that something that students need to learn more about, or is this, this is really a curriculum conversation. And the way curriculum works for this, in sort of that spectrum, is that there's spiraling the curriculum, and when schools make decisions to cover certain topic areas are guided by best practices, but also inform, you being a bilingual school, of how that plays into it as well. I can use the example in my independent school. We taught physics and chemistry in 6th grade instead of the traditional 8th grade. That was a very purposeful decision. There are a lot of reasons why on that, but on any standardized test that our students took in science, they did not well on which would be a more traditional sort of general science or earth science in 6th grade, because we didn't cover it, and we knew we weren't covering it for 2 reasons, and there were pedagogical reasons why we made that decision. And so we communicated that to our families, that this, wasn't something for them to be concerned about. But certainly schools should be looking at that information, because if you're seeing that there's schools that you just spent 6 weeks on teaching statistics and the whole group of students didn't do well, then yes, that's an issue that we need to take up as educators to figure out what's going on there. Okay, so let me pull this back up and just give you your samples here. And I apologize for my computer is it's very, very slow right now. Okay, let's do a share screen. And you wanted to know, did you have a particular math one, Christina? It was, we were talking about reasoning, correct? Is that what you were?
Yeah, so like knowing that there's 2 mathematical subtests, quantitative reasoning and mathematics.
Okay.
Sometimes we see one is much stronger than the other.
Yes.
Make
So,
sense of that.
actually, it's not actually showing up on my slide deck. So let me just talk to it for a minute there in terms of the way that is. So the quantitative reasoning is, again, actually, here we go. Let's show this. So hopefully you can all see, this is a different looking report than the one I showed you for. It's an older version. But the quantitative reasoning, and so we have quantitative reasoning and mathematics down here towards the bottom. So the quantitative reasoning has to do with things like, as you see here, analysis and comparison. And then the mathematics has to do more with like sort of number sense and skill-based mathematics. So there are times when a student might be incredibly strong and they're skill-based, right? They know all their formulas, they know how to do the mathematical operations, but then taking those skills and applying that, or taking those skills and being able to use that in any kind of analysis or comparison might be something that is a challenge for them. But what you can look at, or what I would look at as an educator, is sort of where are they in that spectrum of both. If I'm seeing strong quantitative reasoning skills, but very low mathematics scores, I would probably ask some probing questions. Does this have to, is this what the educator is seeing? What might be going on here? And then just starting to look at also what the curriculum is and how they are using those two types of learnings in the classroom. On the flip side, if I see a student with a really strong mathematical skill, but I see a very low quantitative reasoning, again, I want to start asking questions, but that may also be a curriculum decision. It could also be the age of the students. And so it really leads to more questions to unpack and to be really thinking about the curriculum itself. or how that curriculum might be presented. There are some mathematics curriculums or approaches to math that don't get into some of these higher level thinking skills until much later. And on the flip side, there's some that start that very early and then they don't get into the actual number sense and operations and so forth until a little bit later. Hope that helps, Christina. That's kind of a nuanced one. Let's see. Last question here. Do you see big difference? Since test measures aptitude, do you see big differences in individuals year over year or significant improvement year over year? So brain development is a really interesting topic, and we could spend a lot of time on that. There are certainly, for every student, there are times when they make some really big cognitive leaps, and there's other times when they just, they're processing and they haven't quite hit their stride yet academically. There are some general benchmarks that we could talk about, but I think that would be a more appropriate conversation with Christina and your team in understanding individual student growth. Again, this is not just aptitude, it's potential and that skill base. So there's a lot of nuance in, again, making any sort of judgment. I would definitely recommend having a conversation with Christina about your individual student questions there.
No one had, oh, do you have another one, Kelly?
No, that was it. I think that was the last one.
I'll ask the other one I get asked a lot that no one said yet, which is, I'm looking at my students' scores and they're, presenting as though they're in the 4th and 5th Stanine kind of average within the independent school norm group. But when I get their report card, they have all top marks and it looks like they're high achieving across the board. How do you explain this? I will explain it. So our benchmarks are set as a fixed measure for which, we have confidence that the majority of our students will be able to achieve. We're not grading our students here at CASE on kind of a normative or comparative bell curve, thankfully. So our benchmarks are designed to be, rigorous and achievable by a good number of our students. And yet the ERB scores are comparing our students who are all high achieving in the scope of the world with other high achieving independent school students. And so it may look like a student has a lower score because of their comparative norm group score being, in the lower 50th percentile or something like that, which we would still consider average. But it is possible to be lower achieving in this norm group and still be reaching CASE's rigorous benchmarks because it's a different way of measuring. It's a totally different benchmark against a fixed criteria here on our report card versus a comparative data set in the ERB reporting.
Great. And again, those norm groups, that's what they are. I mean, it's I would say it's a random group in the sense it is of who's taking the assessments at that time during that season at that same level. So and why it's valid and strong, it is, as I was talking about before, if I'm in a room with all persons who are over 6 feet, my relative comparison to those is going to be very different. And then I'm in a room with persons who are of smaller stature. So the important benchmarks, as Christina said, is really taking this in conjunction with all of these other metrics and the understandings the school and the educators have about your students. It is one small piece, an important piece, but it is not the only piece. It really needs to be used with that whole picture, the student. Okay. I think that's it on my end. Christina, any other last questions before we head off?
Not over here. So if you do want more information or just a chat about your child's individual score, you are welcome to email me, and I have a number of appointment slots kind of set up. I'll put my email in the chat, but you all know how to find people in CASE email. So here we go. So just go ahead and reach out if you have further questions before reaching out to the homeroom teacher, please. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a great weekend.